Our guest today is Dr. Isaac Saney. Dr. Saney is a historian, a political scientist. He's based in Canada, and he's a specialist on Cuba, the Caribbean, Black Studies, and the African diaspora history. Quite a portfolio, Dr. Saney, and welcome to Caribbeana.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here on the show. And as you said, quite a portfolio. It's something that sort of comes out, I think, when you're involved in a kind of activism that I've been involved in. You cover a lot of ground, and
Right.
particularly when one is, I guess I could consider myself as a Marxist Pan-Africanist. You
Yes.
necessarily, try and look at the international interconnections between all of these various struggles.
Right, right. Now, on Cuba and internationalization, how should we understand Cuba's role in African liberation struggles, such
Yeah.
as Angola, Namibia, and South Africa?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, it's important to look at these struggles in the context, obviously, of the Cuban Revolution, but of a long history of Cuba's links, even before the revolution, to Africa, right?
Yeah,
And the role of people of African descent in Cuba's national liberation struggles. I mean, there's a history of, slave resistance, of enslaved Africans rising up against slavery in Cuba, but there's also a long history when Cuba began its wars for national liberation in the 19th century. Not only Cubans playing a central role as fighters, but as leaders. There's a famous Antonio Maceo. And then within that is when Jose Marti, arrives on the scene, sort of like the intellectual author, you could say the father of Cuban independence, a major thinker.
yeah,
He comes on the scene. He was obviously of Spanish extraction, but he comes on the scene to articulate why the first war of independence from 1868 to 1878 failed. And he began to actually articulate that one of the central failures was obviously the issue of racism and the issue of the inability to really truly challenge racial discrimination and, of course, the foundations of slavery in Cuba. And so,
yeah,
in a sense, as Winston James in his book, seminal book, Holding Aloft the Banners of Ethiopia said, in a sense, Jose Marti can be seen as the first truly anti-racist European, right? So you
right.
have been fundamentally part of the Cuban Revolution, right? This role of Africans not only as active participants in the liberation struggle of Cuba, but also as intellectual shapers of the thought material that will guide, right,
Mhm.
Cuba's independence struggles later on in the 20th century. So I think that's a very important foundational element, right, and so on. When the
Yeah,
Cuban and of course there's this link obviously to Africa, obviously because millions of a significant portion of the Cuban population, there's about a
right.
million. It's estimated about 1 million Africans came through Matanzas, right, because of the transatlantic slave system and so on. So there's this very strong historical, cultural, intellectual ties to the African continent.
Right.
When the Cuban Revolution trumps um, in 1959, Cuba, and we can talk about it, Cuba goes through a whole number of different things to actually
Mhm.
begin to challenge racial discrimination in the society. Later on, they recognize that many of these measures are not sufficient in and of themselves, and they have to dwell much more deeper on these issues, which is why now there's a huge national debate within Cuba and a national program called Color Cubano, right, to
Ah,
challenge racism and racial discrimination within Cuba. So there's a huge debate within that. But one of the things as well is when the revolution triumphed, just as Jose Marti, when he was leading Cuba's national liberation struggle in the 1890s, envisioned that the Cuban struggle went beyond its geographical boundaries. He saw it as part of continental liberation. So when the Cuban Revolution triumphed, they not only saw the Cuban Revolution as part of a continental struggle for liberation, i.e. in the Americas, but also part of a global struggle. And Africa becomes privileged as a very important part of Cuban foreign policy, right? Cuba very early on begins to develop relationships with the anti-colonial national liberation struggles in Africa. There's a medical contingent that's sent to Algeria from Cuba as well. There's
wow.
also which is documented. Pero Glahesis has written a significant amount of work on this. So there's a medical brigade sent to Algeria. There's all sorts of diplomatic support and material support that's rendered to African national liberation struggles.
Right.
Cuba, for example, when Patrice Lumumba is overthrown, particularly eloquent and vigorous in its condemnation of the West's role in overthrowing Lumumba, simply because he wanted to have Congolese resources for the benefit of the Congolese, right? And
So,
then and then within that, like there's the mission that Che Guevara leads in 1965 to develop a revolutionary movement in Congo. It wasn't successful, right? But Cuba then develops a series of relations with African national liberation struggles. So before, one point I'd like to add here is that, there's a particular relationship that develops with Amilcar Cabral, right? And when Fidel Castro is visiting Guinea-Bissau and is in one of the liberated areas, Amilcar Cabral makes the comment. He says, "I don't believe in life after death." I'm paraphrasing, but it's a very well-known quote. "I don't believe in life after death, but I know that our forefathers would be celebrating to see their children and grandchildren, right, returning to Africa, right, to help Africa in its liberation struggles." So this very deep relationship that Cuba develops with its anti-colonial struggles, diplomatic support, material support, training and educating people within Cuba itself. And of course, there's the immense support that Cuba actually provides in Southern Africa, where in the midst of South Africa trying to undermine Angolan independence and trying to establish regional hegemony from 1975 up until 1991, over 400,000 Cubans end up serving in Southern Africa as soldiers, as educators, as engineers. But the soldiers play a very significant role in defeating the military behemoth that is the racist South African apartheid state, eventually defeating them together with the Angolans in 1987-88 in a major battle around a place called Quito Cuanavale and on the borders of Angola and Namibia, which play, I would argue, a very significant role. And I've sort of argued this in my book, Cuba, apartheid, and Cuba, Africa, and apartheid's end, Africa's children return, where this defeat in Angola in 87-88 plays a central role in accelerating the end of apartheid. So I know that's a big mouthful, right, that I've given, covering that. But it's a very profound relationship that Cuba has maintained with Africa, even to this day.
But what lessons can the Caribbean learn today or draw from Cuba's model of education, health, and international solidarity?
Yeah. Well, I think first on international solidarity, it's the fact that, that particularly with Africa, for example, but with other countries in Latin America, that this is not only a natural duty, but it also builds those profound links between peoples, right? We're living in a time of tremendous flux. I mean, that's an understatement. A time of dangers of world conflagration, i.e. world war, of tremendous inequality, a time when genocide is being normalized and routinized, not only in Gaza, which we see at the forefront of the struggle, but in places like Congo and in places like the Sudan and so forth, right? And international solidarity is essential to, in a sense, challenging Western imperialism and Western domination. It's essential to, in a sense, asserting our dignity as human beings, right? And it's important, in a sense, to building just societies. International solidarity, Cuba's internationalist missions, whether it's the support for anti-colonial struggles, whether it's the Cuban medical brigades that serve all across the world with thousands upon thousands of doctors providing health care. Cuba saw that not just as part of its historic duty, not just part of a natural solidarity, but also as integral to building what they saw as a just society domestically and so forth, right? That this value of self-sacrifice, these ideas, sort of not to to get into ethic philosophy here, but this idea of building an ethos of solidarity where you demonstrate social love to fellow human beings, as opposed to the ethos of having where your value as a human being, as a society, is determined by how much material goods you can accumulate. I mean, that's not to say that that material goods, right, and a certain level of prosperity is not a good thing and not necessary, but also it has to go hand in hand with this kind of international solidarity. So Cuba, in a sense, is providing an example, despite the U.S. economic war, despite errors and mistakes that have been made, but they're providing a model of what relations can be between nations, right? I remember having conversations with the late great Norman Gervan about reciprocity, right? Okay, that idea that there used to be this idea that the kind of model we should build is of mutual benefit, where each country gains, right, from trade with other countries and so on. reciprocity, right? But Cuba is also given the idea, well, no, natural solidarity some might engage at sometimes reciprocity, but sometimes there's no reciprocity involved. Sometimes it's a natural duty, right? And I think in terms of what they've been able to do with Haiti, for example, in Africa, in fact, Haiti and Cuba have a very unique relationship. Cuba has seen a lot of historical parallels between what happened to the Haitian Revolution, the Cordon Sanitaire, the Western sabotage, and what's been imposed in the Cuban Revolution. So they see the natural duty. And so in a sense, where we have solidarity as, in a sense, something that's given because it's natural through human empathy, through human caring, through social love, is essential for building a better world. And we see a world today where people are increasingly openly attacking empathy, openly attacking the rule of international law, openly attacking the idea that there should be equality and mutual respect amongst peoples. And so Cuba provides a counterexample.
Now, how do U.S. policies continue to shape Cuba's challenges and opportunities?
Yeah, well, the United States has waged unrelenting, unceasing economic war against Cuba on numerous fronts, right? The economic war is incredibly immense. People may have read just recently, Cuba was going through the fourth or fifth collapse of its national electrical grid system in the last year or so. A lot of that has to do, as people don't realize, with the economic war against Cuba. First and foremost, the Achilles heel of Cuba is fuel. It doesn't produce oil, right? And the oil it does, enough oil necessary for its own domestic use. And the oil it does produce is of a high sulfur content. So like most countries, Cuba imports its oil. But because of U.S. economic sanctions and U.S. deliberately targeting the energy section, it costs Cuba 3 to 4 times more to import the same amount of oil that another country would import. And any ship docking in a Cuban port is banned, prohibited from docking in a U.S. port for over 6 months. So therefore, Cuba's shipping costs become even more inordinately expensive. So that's one thing as well, right? So that's a big issue. On top of that as well is in terms of the upgrading the Cuban electrical grid itself, the actual machines, the actual, capital and so on becomes extremely difficult because the United States dominates so much of the manufacturing. And what happens is the U.S. will do two things, is that, if you want to export to Cuba from another country, and it's bizarre, this extraterritoriality, you have to prove that less than 10% of U.S. components is involved in actually whatever you're supporting, right? You're exporting, or you will face U.S. sanctions, which often means exclusion from the U.S. market, and also perhaps being excluded from the SWIFT market. So the U.S. has raised this unrelenting economic war against Cuba on medicines, on a whole slew of fronts to economically asphyxiate the country. And there's a very famous, if not infamous, notorious memorandum from April of 1960, where there's this person, Mallory, who was in the U.S. in the U.S. Department of State, where he outlines at the time, this is 1960, that he recognizes that, and it's a memorandum that's declassified, you can find it very easily. He recognized that the Cuban government, or the Castro government, as he says, has, majority of support among the people, almost overwhelming support, and the only way to alienate that support is to impose an economic blockade to asphyxiate the country, such that you increase such shortages and hardships that will lead to an implosion of the system, right? So Cuba's faced this unceasing war for over 60 years, targeting all elements of the economy to try and not only make governance almost impossible, to make the promises and commitments the Cuban government has made to its people, to make it as difficult as possible for them to fulfill that. And in the context of Trump coming to power, when Trump's first administration, he imposed over 240 additional means, right? Additional sanctions against Cuba. And this was aimed at making the economy screen, okay? But more importantly, undermining the gains of the Cuban Revolution. Universal healthcare, universal education, a social security system that encompasses everybody, right? To make life hard in Cuba, and more importantly, to destroy the idea that there can be a counterexample to the kind of, unbridled, vicious kind of capitalist societies that exist in the Americas. And on top of that as well, there's been invasions, there's been assassination attempts, there's a whole psychological campaign against Cuba to sort of portray Cuba as a hellhole, right? While anyone who travels to Cuba will see that Cuba has its challenges, and Cubans are more than willing to admit the errors that they have made, but it's not the hellhole that it's made. It's a society trying to survive under very difficult, extremely conditions of what is like wartime and peace, to try and build a more just society.
Right. But you have spoken about the importance of linking the Caribbean struggle with African, Nova Scotian, and global Black communities.
Mm.
How do you see these connections evolving today?
I think those connections are extremely important. I think, first of all, on the issue of reparations, right, in which the CARICOM countries are leading this in reparations, right?
Yes,
I think this becomes essential. It's become part of, it really received an impetus coming out of if you look at it historically, at the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism, other related intolerance that happened in September of 2001, and then sort of got sidelined because of 9/11. There was
yeah,
a call for reparations, but that's gained momentum, right? Okay, both in terms of the research and in terms of the political force behind it, right? And now, basically, I see that many people in the reparations movement are finding support among African countries because it call for reparations, okay, is one in which not only for what's happened to indigenous people who were exterminated, to transatlantic slavery, in which millions of African sisters and brothers were ripped from their countries. Let's not count how many died in the journey, not that count the wealth that was made off their backs, the Industrial Revolution and so forth,
right.
but also the impact on Africa in terms of colonization. So these links with Africa provides, for example, an idea in a sense that the reparations movement can gain that added impetus. But it's also, I think, more importantly, and reparations, you have different themes in reparations, but it's also a revolutionary or radical conception of reparations, which calls for reordering of the world. There used to be in the 70s and the early 80s a call for a new international economic order, right? A restructuring of international relations, a fairer terms of trade, technology transfer, canceling of the debt, and so forth. That's what we need nowadays, right?
Yeah.
And particularly what's happening in the Sahel, right, with countries now throwing off neocolonialism and so forth, attempting to throw off neocolonialism. We see with Africa, in a sense, rising on the world stage, where by the 21st century, it'll be the most populous continent, and it also has the youngest population. So you can imagine the economic potential and that Africa will have at the end of the 21st century.
Exactly.
We are looking now for restructuring of world international economic affairs, right?
Right.
I think the Caribbean, which often has been seen and dismissed, we've often been dismissed as specks, right? Okay, as the American backyard. This will give us the kind of strength, right, and the allies, right, and the solidarity we need to assert our independence as islands, to assert a different economic model that serves the interests not only of our independence but of our peoples themselves, and perhaps give an impetus for pan-Caribbean unity.
Wow. As director of the Transition Year program, how do you see education as a tool for liberation?
Yeah. Well, I'm no longer director of the Transition Year program, but I was a director for a considerable period of time, and I've now moved into coordinating what we call the Black and African Diaspora Studies degree program, which is the first of its kind in Canada, founded in September 2023.
And that's in Nova Scotia, right?
That's in Nova Scotia, Dalhousie University. Both of those programs are Dalhousie University.
Right.
I see it as being revolutionary, of teaching people critical consciousness, but also transforming them into conscious shakers and movers, right, in transforming their conditions. The Black and African Diaspora Studies degree program is rooted in the Black radical tradition, and its pedagogy draws a lot from the groundings with my brothers, or groundings with my sisters and brothers in today's language, of Walter Rodney, right? Yeah. Empowering people, right? First, to understand this history and to challenge the falsehoods and misinformation about the history of the Caribbean peoples, of African peoples, of colonized peoples of the global South, but also to recover their agency, to show that people of the global South have always had the capacity to transform their conditions, right? Okay, whatever the zigs and zags, the steps forwards and backwards, the shortcomings and so forth, the agency exists, whether it's from indigenous resistance against colonialism to enslaved African rebellions, right? And I always like to point out that next year will mark the 250th anniversary of the beginning of the U.S. War of Independence, and people talk about that. But the Haitian Revolution was a generator of much more profound ideas of human rights and human liberty than the French Revolution and than the the American so-called war, American so-called war, the so-called American Revolution, the War of Independence, right? So,
Right.
so both agencies, both in terms of liberating themselves and trying to build new societies, but as intellectual authors, right? And so part and parcel of education is to show people, as Paulo Freire argued in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as Walter Rodney has shown through The Pedagogy of Groundings with My Sisters and Brothers, that people can be their own liberators, their own emancipators. They
Yeah.
can understand the world, and they can find ways to transform what Mumia Abu-Jamal, the US political prisoner, declared our dull realities, right? And as Franz Fanon said, each generation, in a sense, has to discover its mission, right? Okay. And the mission today, in the face of ecological collapse, global warfare, the last, shall we say, throes of white supremacy, right? Capitalism and imperialism in its death throes, we hope, right? Okay. That their generation is to transform this situation, right? And build a world fit for human beings. So,
Right.
so the education itself becomes a tool so people can know their history, know their potentials, but also see it as a means by which they can transform the world in better ways.
Right. Now, finally, what message do you have for young people in the Caribbean diaspora who are seeking to shape a more just and equitable world?
I think that's a tough question, but I remember what one of the last messages of Kwame Ture, the late Stokely Carmichael, was
Yes.
organize, 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 right? And
Yeah.
Malcolm X said, and I'm a historian, so probably I'm biased, that of all our studies, history is best suited to reward or research or something of that nature, right?
Yeah.
So I
Yes.
think but also we're part of a global struggle, right? And also the Caribbean being probably the most thoroughly colonized space in the world, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think this is the point that Hurley Beckles makes very clearly, right? The most thoroughly colonized space in the world is ironically the space that's most vulnerable to climate change, right? Okay. So we have to throw ourselves into these transformative struggles, right? Not only in terms of the Caribbean, but also in terms of these other struggles that are emerging in the world. And I think one of the things that's happening is because of the austerity across the West, because of the danger of war and the normalizing of genocide. A lot of these struggles are coalescing, right? Okay. Okay.
Right.
We and the Caribbean has always been this unique space, right? This internationalist space, right? This space that has generated some of the most powerful intellectuals. I mean, the common stereotype of the Caribbean is, carnival and partying and all this sort of stuff, which I have nothing
Right.
against great food, right? Okay.
Right.
Also generated these powerful intellectuals. And some of them you knew yourself, but like C.L.R. James, Franz Fanon, Claudia
Right.
Jones, right?
Right.
I mean, I
Right.
can name so many of these people. And so we have a role to play because we've had this unique historical space. Just as the Vietnamese people in the 60s, right, had a unique role to play in a global liberation because of the particular historical time and moment they found themselves in. The Caribbean has had that because of our unique history of being so thoroughly colonized, okay, a particular space in the world where we have, and my colleague Dr. Chevy Eugene always likes to point this, where in a sense we've generated so much of use, not just for the Caribbean intellectually, but for the rest of the world. So I would like us to draw on those traditions, the Caribbean diaspora, right? To draw on these intellectual traditions, these traditions of resistance and struggle, right? And in many ways translate them into the conditions of the 21st century.
Dr. Isaac Saney, we thank you for sharing your scholarship, your vision, and your passion, which I can see with us today. And we look forward to talking to you again. And, be careful, Godspeed, and continue the struggle.
Well, thank you so much, Vaughn. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to be with someone who has met so many people, done so much, right, and made such an important contribution. Thank
Yes, thanks. Okay. I've been speaking with Dr. Isaac Saney, a scholar, a historian, and a indeed fantastic individual. This is Vaughn Martin. Caribbeana continues.